Today we will talk about one of the greatest historical mysteries. What really happened to Kyivan Rus? With a powerful state that stretched from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea, with a cultural center that captivated Europe, and with a city that bore the proud name of the mother of Russian cities. When you ask this question at school or on the internet, you most often get one short answer: the Mongols came and destroyed everything. This is a classic, generally accepted explanation. And it is incomplete. Even, one might say, historically lazy. Imagine that you are watching an action series. The hero dies. And you are told, well, he was shot. And you ask, but why did he end up where he could have been shot? Who framed him? Why did his friends abandon him? You see, behind every final blow, there is always a long, complicated story. The same is true of Kyivan Rus. Of course, the Mongols, or rather the Tatar Mongols, led by Batu, dealt a terrible, fatal blow. But this was only the final chord in a tragic symphony that had been playing for at least 150 years before their arrival. So, what really killed the majestic Rus? Who or what was the real culprit? We suggest you forget about school textbooks for a few minutes and dive into the depths of medieval politics, economics, and even family dramas. Today we will look at 5 key, less obvious reasons that made Kyivan Rus a fragile, cracked nut that the Mongols could only crush. We will talk about the ambitions of the princes and the cursed right of succession to the throne. About how trade routes changed, and why gold suddenly stopped flowing to Kyiv. About how the regions began to live their own, independent lives. And even about how the spiritual split undermined the ideological foundations of the state. Ready? Then let's begin. A drama will unfold before you, in which there is not one villain, but a whole complex of factors that, like a chain, connected and dragged the once powerful empire to the bottom. If you think politics in the 21st century is complicated, then you simply haven't seen what was happening inside the princely dynasty of the Rurikoviches. It wasn't just a dynasty, it was a huge, eternally feuding family, whose internal strife constantly tore the state apart. Imagine a state where the only rule of succession to the throne could be described as follows: every prince has the right to everything, and no one has the right to anything in particular. This is exactly how the so-called ladder law worked. What kind of miracle law is this? It was a unique and, as it turned out, self-destructive system. According to it, thrones, and especially the Kyiv throne, the most desirable one, were not passed down from father to son. They were passed down horizontally, from older brother to younger. And when all the brothers in one generation died, the turn passed to the eldest representative of the next generation, that is, to the eldest nephew. Sounds noble, right? Like a family contract. But in practice, it was a recipe for endless civil war. First, as soon as a Grand Duke died, a race for the throne began. Every living prince in line had the right to move up a step, often to a more lucrative principality. This was called transplanting. Second, this system required princes to constantly move with their wives from one city to another, depending on how their turn progressed. How many rulers do you know who likes to move around constantly? None of them had a deep attachment to the land they temporarily ruled. Their idea was not about the development of this particular city, but about how to earn more and jump to Kyiv faster. Third, and this is the scariest thing, the system did not clearly define who exactly was the eldest. And what should the sons of the prince who was sitting in Kyiv do? When their father dies, their place in the queue drops sharply, because the priority goes to their uncles. Of course, the sons did not agree with this and started a war for their rightful inheritance. What is the result? Instead of uniting their forces and resources against external enemies, for example, the same Polovtsians, the princes of Rus spent these resources on wars against each other. Do you think it is possible to build a single, strong state, when in the 12th century, Kyiv could survive 6 captures and robberies in just 30 years? What is the value of such unity, when princes from different regions, such as the Vladimir Suzdal Prince Andrei Bogolyubsky, could come, burn Kyiv, which he did in 1169, and at the same time refused to sit on the Kyiv throne, taking only the symbols of power and leaving the city in ruins. This was a clear signal. The Kyivan table had ceased to be the only center of attraction. Each strong regional prince believed that it was better to be an independent master at home than to constantly fight for phantom power in unstable Kyiv. The dynastic conflicts of the Rurikoviches did not simply weaken the state. They fostered regional egoism and decomposed the very idea of unity. This was the first, deepest split, which laid the foundation for further catastrophe. The latter law became a curse, and internecine strife, a national sport, which ultimately led to decline. What is power? Power is not only military power, it is, above all, money. Or, as we would say today, powerful economic flows. Kyiv was majestic not only because of the beauty of its cathedrals. It was majestic because it was the economic heart of Eastern Europe. Its wealth was based on the famous path from the Varangians to the Greeks. What kind of road is this? It was a real highway of the Middle Ages, connecting Scandinavia, the world of the Vikings, the Varangians, with the prosperous Byzantine Empire and its capital Constantinople, the world of the Greeks. The people of Kyiv received incredible profits from controlling this trade route. Customs duties, fees, trade in furs, honey, and slaves. Kyiv was the gateway between the north and the south. But in the 11th and 13th centuries, this economic golden vein began to dry up. Why? Change in trade routes. This happened due to two global processes that the princes of Kyivan Rus could not influence in any way. The fall of Constantinople, Fourth Crusade. You have probably heard of the Crusades? They were military expeditions of European knights to the east. And then in 1240, an event occurred that was a shock to the entire Christian world. The Crusaders, instead of going to fight in Jerusalem, captured and plundered Constantinople, the capital of Byzantium and a spiritual and commercial beacon for Russia. What did this mean for Kyiv? The end of the Byzantine Empire as a dominant player on the Black Sea. Trade through Constantinople declined sharply. Money, goods, silk, spices, all this ceased to flow to the north in the necessary quantities. Dominance of the Mediterranean. At the same time, Italian city-states such as Venice and Genoa were becoming maritime giants. They established direct, more profitable trade routes across the Mediterranean. They no longer needed the long, dangerous, and slow Varangian to Greek route. What was the effect? Effect number 1. The Varangian to Greek route became a secondary route. Effect number 2. Kyiv's income from trade, which was its financial foundation, was drastically reduced. Lost influence on regions. When money stopped flowing to the center, Kyiv began to lose its political influence. Why? Once upon a time, the Grand Prince of Kyiv could finance major military campaigns, pay his warriors, give gifts, and maintain a huge administrative apparatus. He was the banker for all the other principalities. But when its treasury was empty, regional princes began to think, why should I listen to Kyiv? I am rich myself, my rivers are full of fish, my lands are fertile, and I control the local trade routes myself. Look at Galicia and Volhynia in the west, which traded with Poland and Hungary. Or at the Principality of Vladimir Suzdal in the northeast, which prospered thanks to the river routes on the Volga and actively colonized new lands. These new economic centers were no longer dependent on the declining Kyivan purse. Can an economically weak center support a huge state? Of course not. Could a dispersed economy withstand an external threat? Certainly not. Kyiv's economic decline is the second and perhaps most fundamental reason for its collapse. Kyiv was no longer profitable. And when economic interests diverged, political unification became simply unnecessary for regional elites. If dynastic strife was a virus and economic decline was exhaustion, then fragmentation was the final diagnosis of collapse. Kyivan Rus did not disappear suddenly. It gradually dissolved into dozens, and then hundreds of separate, i.e., separate, principalities. What does separate mean? A separate is a part of a larger whole that has received its own destiny, its own plot. Instead of having one ruler in Kyiv, we got 12, 15, and later more independent states in miniature. World map, the emergence of strong regional centers. As Kyiv began to weaken, space became available for new stars on the political map. These stars were not just small cities, they were real regional empires that began to develop in their own way. Galicia-Volhynia Principality, Western Bastion. In the southwest, the powerful Galicia-Volhynia Principality arose. It was a fertile land that had its own sources of wealth, for example, salt, and a favorable geographical position for trade with Europe. Hungary, Poland, Bohemia. Vladimir Monomac, and later Roman Mstislavich and Daniil Galician created monolithic principalities here that paid little attention to Kyiv. Galicia and Vladimir Volhynia became their new capitals. They had their own strong aristocracy, boyars, who were often stronger than the prince himself. This was a completely different European model of development. Vladimir Suzdal Principality, Northeast. The absolute opposite was the Vladimir Suzdal Principality. It was located in the forested lands of the northeast, far from steppe raids. The princes here built absolute power over their land, relying on the squad and colonization of new territories. Princes such as Andrei Bogolyubsky, the one who burned Kyiv, deliberately ignored Kyiv, building new centers, Vladimir, Suzdal, and later Moscow. They actually created a new state model, where the prince was everything, and the boyar opposition was nothing. Their interest was in the east and north, and not on the Dnieper rapids. Chernihiv, Polotsk, Ryazan. In addition to these two giants, there was a whole series of medium and small principalities: Chernihiv, Pereyaslav, Polotsk, Murom, Ryazan. Each of them became a self-sufficient political unit. Crossed swords, each principality plays its own politics. What were the consequences of this fragmentation? Military weakness. Instead of one large 100,000-strong army of Rus, we got 10 small, 10,000-strong armies that never acted together. When one principality was attacked, the others calmly watched, often even rejoiced at the weakening of their competitor. Foreign policy. Each principality began to enter into its own alliances with external enemies. For example, one prince could call on the Polovtsi to fight against his brother prince, without thinking about national interests. This was chaos and betrayal at the state level. Ideological crisis. The loss of a single center meant the loss of a single idea. Instead of being Rus, they became the land of Vladimir, the land of Gallic, the land of Chernigov. Fragmentation was not just a division of territory, it was the collapse of a single political will. Before the arrival of the Mongols, Kyivan Rus de facto no longer existed as a single state. It was a conglomerate of warring mini-states, ready to be absorbed by an external enemy. Often, when talking about enemies, only the Mongols are mentioned. But on the southern borders of Russia, especially around Kyiv and Pereyaslav, for 2 centuries a constant, exhausting, undeclared war was waged. And the most important enemies were the Polovtsi, or as they were also called, the Kipchaks. Imagine a state that is constantly on the warpath. Its southern borders are a front line hundreds of kilometers long. And on this front line there is not a regular army, but only border fortresses and Zaporozhian Cossacks of that time, the Pereyaslav and Chernihiv squads. Tornado, constant devastation of the southern borders. The Polovtsi were a nomadic Turkic people who came to the steppes in the second half of the 11th century, displacing other nomads, the Pecheneg. They were ideal steppe warriors, fast, maneuverable, brave, and cruel. Their raids were a real disaster for Rus. Suddenness. They came with lightning speed, on their light horses, plundered villages, took people into slavery and burned crops. Terror. The purpose of the raids was not only loot, but also intimidation. They turned the fertile southern lands of Rus into a wasteland, forcing the peasants to migrate north, including to the Vladimir Suzdal Principality, which further weakened the Kyivan land. Why was it so exhausting? Economic exhaustion. Rus was forced to constantly keep a huge number of troops, squadrons, on standby for defense. And the army had to be fed and armed. Imagine how much silver and furs went not to building cathedrals or trade, but to protecting the border and ransoming prisoners. These constant expenses undermined the economy of an already weakened Kyiv. Political disintegration. In the best of times, as under Vladimir Monomakh in the 12th century, princes could unite and strike the Polovtsi in the depths of the steppe. But, as we remember from the previous chapters, later internecine strife became the priority. Could the princes of Galicia, who traded with Europe, be concerned that their distant Peryaslav relatives were suffering from raids? No. They were even worse. Some princes themselves used the Polovtsi as mercenaries in their internal wars against other princes. This was an act of national betrayal and the height of cynicism. Instead of a defender, the Polovtsi turned into an ally in a fratricidal war. How defense exhausted the system. The constant military threat prevented the state from developing. It required the concentration of resources and centralized power. But precisely at a time when unity was needed, the dynastic system and economy led Rus to fragmentation. Constant population losses, destruction of infrastructure, inability to develop trade through the south. The Polovtsi were not the main cause of decline, but they were a constantly open, bleeding wound. They accelerated the process of disintegration, exhausted Russia militarily and economically, and, most importantly, corrupted its political elites, making them ready for the most shameful alliances. When the Mongols appeared on the horizon, they saw not a strong monolithic state, but an exhausted, divided territory into warring pieces, which had been at war with itself and with nomads for 200 years. We have reached a point that most people consider the beginning of the end, but which was actually only the end of the end. The Mongol invasion is indeed a disaster, but it was a consequence of all the previous problems, not their cause. Imagine a sick person. He does not take treatment for years, does not follow the regimen, and then he catches a cold. A cold is not the main cause of death, but it becomes the last straw for an already weakened organism. Kyivan Rus was this weakened organism. Chart decreasing why Russia was already weakened. When the Mongol and Russian armies first met on the Kalka River in 1223, Russia already had the following systemic problems. Political split, dynasties. The princes were busy with internecine strife. They came to the Kalka as three separate, poorly coordinated armies, Kyiv, Chernigov, Galicia Volyn, which did not trust each other. One of the princes, Mstislav the Brave, Galician, fled after the defeat, without even warning the other princes about the danger. Another, Mstislav of Kyiv, sat out on a fortified hill while the Mongols crushed his allies. Such unity was a parody of an army. Economic decline. Kyiv the center could not finance the all-Russian army. Each region paid only for its own defense, which made it insufficient. Military exhaustion. Polovtsi, the southern principalities, were constantly exhausted by the fight against the Polovtsi. There were no fresh reserves. The Mongols under Batu, who really came in 1237 to stay, faced not one empire, but separate principalities. And they used its own internal weakness against Russia. They attacked sequentially. First Ryazan, then Vladimir, then Chernigov, and finally, in December 1241, Kyiv. Not a single principality came to the aid of another. Everyone hoped that the disaster would pass by their lot. Tornado Mongols. This is the finale, not the cause. The Mongol invasion was the epicenter of destruction. Cities were destroyed, about 40% of all Russian cities fell into decline, elites were exterminated, and vassal dependence, label and tribute, was established over Russia. But the key point is the following. The Mongols only completed a process that had begun much earlier. They were like vultures that flew to an already half-dead body. They froze the political situation, stopping internecine strife, because now there was one master, the Khan, but legalized fragmentation. They supported regional centers, such as Vladimir and later Moscow, that were obedient, and suppressed those that resisted, Kyiv, Chernihiv. Could a single, strong, centralized Kyivan Rus have stood up to the Mongols? Perhaps not, because it was the greatest military power of the 13th century. But it could have put up a stronger fight and perhaps preserved political continuity, as some countries in Western Europe did. But a divided Rus was doomed to defeat. The Mongols were merely the executioner who carried out the sentence imposed on Rus by its own princes and economic realities. Every great state is based not only on swords and money, but also on a common idea, on a single spirit. In medieval Russia, this unifying spirit was the Orthodox Church. Prince Vladimir the Great brought Christianity to the Rus lands in 1988. This was not just a religious act, it was a political and civilizational choice. The Church became the spiritual pillar of the state. Unity. The Metropolitan of Kyiv was the only spiritual shepherd for all Rus lands, regardless of who sat on the throne. Culture. The Church brought writing, education, architecture, councils, and laws, church statutes. But with increasing fragmentation, this spiritual unity began to crack at the seams. Broken heart schism in church centers. Let's remember how regional princes began to ignore Kyiv. The same thing happened with church centers. The struggle for the metropolis. The most striking example is the actions of the Vladimir Suzdal princes. They began to demand from the Patriarch of Constantinople, to whom the Kyiv metropolis was subordinate, the creation of a separate metropolis in their region in order to be independent of Kyiv even spiritually. The transfer of the residence. In fact, the Kyiv metropolitan in the 14th century, after the Mongol pogrom, began to wander. He moved his residence first to Vladimiron Klyazma, and later to Moscow. Although it nominally continued to be called Kyiv, the real center of the spiritual life of Rus went to the northeast, again, due to the weakening and danger of Kyiv. What did this mean for ideology? Candle, loss of the single spiritual line. The Church ceased to be a neutral arbiter and a common denominator for all principalities. It became a tool in the hands of regional rulers. The princes of the northeast used it to legitimize their new capital, proclaiming themselves defenders of orthodoxy. The Galician Volyn princes, feeling isolated, also repeatedly tried to create a separate Galician metropolis in order to be equal in status with the northeast. The ideological crisis was that the common spiritual space of Rus had collapsed. At a time when there was no common political or economic will, spiritual power could hold the country together. But when it too began to fragment, the idea of a united Rus faded away. Can one call a state something that has lost a single capital, a single army, a single treasury, and a single spiritual center? What idea could now unite the Vladimir Suzdal prince, who is at war with Novgorod, and the Galician Volyn prince, who is looking at Poland? None. The ideological crisis was the final collapse that made the fall of Kyivan Rus inevitable. We have come a long way from a simple explanation of Mongols and all, to a deep analysis of a systemic crisis. So, what really happened to Kyivan Rus? Short answer, it was not killed with a single blow, it died of a chronic disease that was treated incorrectly. Full answer, Kyivan Rus was a system that had exhausted itself. Its old political model, based on ladder law, stopped working in the 12th century. This model was created for the early state, where there was still a general will of the great princes. But it did not stand the test of time and the ambitions of new generations. Summary: complex of factors. Not one reason, but a complex of factors, like a chain, pulled the state down. Dynastic feuds, the cursed ladder law, made internal war a permanent state of Rus. Economic decline of Kyiv. The change in trade routes deprived Kyiv of its financial basis, which undermined its political authority. Political fragmentation. Strong regional centers emerged, Halych, Vladimir Suzdal, which refused to play by the Kyivan rules. External exhaustion. 200 years of constant Polovtsian raids exhausted the military and economic potential of the southern principalities. Ideological crisis. The collapse of church unity and the loss of a single spiritual center finally split the idea of Rus. The Mongols, Tatar Mongols, came to the theater of military operations, where the main acts had already been played out. They were only a cruel orderly who recorded death and imposed their will on the fragments of former greatness. World map, a legacy that became the foundation for future states. But the story does not end there. Kyivan Rus disappeared, but the Rus heritage, language, culture, church tradition was preserved. These specific principalities, these fragments of the empire, did not die. They transformed and became the basis for the formation of new, future states. The Galicia-Volhynian Principality, which later became part of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania and the Kingdom of Poland, gave rise to western Ukrainian lands, preserving the Rus, Ukrainian, language and culture. The Chernihiv and Kyivan lands, like Volhynia, became the core around which the Grand Duchy of Lithuania was formed, which became the true heir to Rus statehood, preserving Rus as the state language. The Polotsk and Turiv lands became the basis for the formation of Belarusian identity. The Vladimir Suzdal lands became the basis for the rise of the Moscow Principality, which later became the Muscovite Kingdom. Thus, the death of Kyivan Rus was not the end, but the birth of a new stage. A stage where separate national identities began to form on the ruins of the old world, which eventually led to the emergence of modern peoples. Ukrainians, Belarusians, and Russians, each of whom in their own way inherited part of the great Kyivan heritage. This was a story not about a fall, but about rebirth. And which principality, in your opinion, would have coped best with the Mongols if it had acted independently? Write your opinion in the comments.